This is the story of Adele. This is a vintage coat by Adele Simpson, and she has come to my studio needing a new lining. So I'll give a spin so you can see what she looks like from all angles. As you can see, she's a swingback coat and beautifully made. So what she's coming here for, like I said, was a lining. I will outline the process because her lining was in sad shape. But here she is. So here is the coat laid out. You can see it's an Adele Simpson. This is probably from the 1950s. It's quite a lovely coat. And it's a swingback coat. I'll go into a little bit of detail later, but look at the matching on those pockets. Isn't that amazing? It's a beautifully made coat. This was probably high-end ready-to-wear, but the finishing is quite lovely. I'm going to pan over here, and there is the lining. We'll see it momentarily, but she needs a new lining, and so that's what we're going to get. So I'll show you some details on this. So as I said, look at the matching on that pocket. It's quite wonderful. The buttons are not what you would call avant-garde, but they definitely work, and I believe they are original to this coat. They need to be restitched, but we will take care of that later. Now, what I find really fascinating about this coat, I'm going to open it up on the hem here. So what you can see is the hem in this area here. I need to put that up a little bit. It's come loose. The center back seam. And my guess is, you can see how the seam allowances aren't dead parallel. My guess is that they sort of played around with the seam to get the seam to match and didn't really worry so much about whether these two seam allowances were the same width. But what's customary on a coat like this is a swingback coat, is the coat itself. If you look at the hem itself is really a little bit ragged here. And when we get over to, here, I'll just bring it up to the camera here. So it looks a little ragged. It's just a light catch stitch. But then when we get about a third of the way in, you can see that the raw edge is turned under and it's hemmed. Because as you'll see in the finished coat, the object here is that the lining, which I'll bring in a moment to show you, the lining is not as full as the full sweep of the garment. So it's hemmed to the garment at a certain place, but then this part here around to the center back, the two are hemmed separately. So it's sort of a hybrid. It's a closed lining slash dropped lining. The dropped lining would be back here. So next I'm going to bring in the lining to show you how the lining is cut, because in these particular garments, the lining is not as full as the coat itself. So here we are. What I've done is I've sort of placed the lining in the position where it would join the facing. And if you look down in here, you see that the fold here, that's the fold, the center back fold, or it's actually a seam, of the lining is slightly smaller than the garment itself. It's interesting that it's cut on this center back fold is on somewhat of a bias. And you can see here, we have a side seam on the lining, which we don't have on the body. Let me take this away. Because you can see here, the front is cut as one full piece. There's no seaming. That's quite a wide piece of fabric. So they needed to put a seam in the lining to make it economical to cut, and the lining is a little bit narrower so that you don't create a bind inside the garment. So now let me just show you the lining hem, because okay, here we are. So now just bring this out here. Okay, see this here, this is where the lining joined the facing. I wish I had taken some video before I removed the lining, but sorry, I decided this after. So the lining is hand finished to the hem allowance to the side seam, which then coincides. You know, there's this here, this finishes to the hem allowance here. So then here, since the edge of the hem allowance is turned under on the body, they do a similar thing on the lining. So that is, I mean, you can tell it's come down over the years, but this was turned, stitched, and blind hemmed in its original life. So this is a hybrid. This is it's quite a wonderful cut, quite a wonderful coat, and as I showed you in the initial video after everything was done, it's quite beautiful, has a lot of good movement. So next, we're going to look more at the lining. So here we are, this is the lining, and I may have said earlier, with my reference to the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is kind of what we're dealing with. We have a lining that has seen far better days. So what I would say, if you have a coat and the lining looks like it's starting to get a little ratty, have it repaired before you get to this point. So what I'm going to have to do is, the sleeve here looks relatively intact. Let me just turn this over here. Yeah, I got a little bit of a split here, but it's a clean split. So what I will probably do is take this sleeve off, and then looking over here and see if this sleeve is, actually this sleeve is in better shape, somewhat. And this armhole here is in a little better shape. But this is where you get out the painter's tape. You want to actually, what I will do, I will go off camera, I'm going to flip this over, and on the front, I'm going to mark the stitching lines, I'm going to mark some matching notches, and I'm going to get these pieces separated, because what we want to do before we actually get a pattern is we want to get it pasted together as best we can, and then we're going to have to do a little guesswork, kind of like archaeologists did with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, this is the center back seam. So looking at the two sleeves, this sleeve here, the armhole looks a little more intact, even though you have a few more tears on the actual body. And so then scanning over to here, this sleeve is a little more shredded, but the armhole seems to give me a little more information. So what I will do now, back over here, I made a mark where the shoulder seam hits, so I know on the sleeve that's where the shoulder seam hits. Now, it's a little bit difficult to discern where these marks here hit because everything has torn loose. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to cut these two sleeves free from the bodice, and then I will open out the shoulder seams and lay this out to see which side I'm going to use, or if I have to sort of make a pastiche of both sides to make one. Now notice I'm cutting right on the stitching line. You don't have to take the seams out for this. You're not reassembling this, so why would you waste time cutting everything or picking all these seams out? You can cut everything apart. It also, the beauty of this is if you're cutting along the stitching lines instead of ripping everything apart, you're less likely to stretch something. I mean, you're kind of playing it fast and loose here, but as you can see, I'm cutting this, and see, it's a ready-to-wear garment. So it was good ready to wear, but it was ready to wear. So some of this stuff is a little bit crooked. We'll have to clean that up in the pattern making. But you can see here, I'm cutting right on the stitching line as best I can. And so I'm going to come down to here and then give that a clip. And let's see, has that freed everything up? Okay, so I have one of the sleeves. So now what I can do is I can come in here, and I've made a matching notch because we have a little bit of a tuck for the shoulder, for the shaping in the front. And I will just cut right on that stitching line. So here we are. I will go do that to the other sleeve, lay everything out flat, and show you the result. So here we have the entire lining laid out flat without the sleeves. And so really what you're looking for is any kind of clues as to what is missing that you need to sort of fill in. So now this one over here, this armhole is a little more tattered, but what I liked about this one, you can see the seam allowances remained intact. So that is roughly what the shape of that seam allowance, or the armhole seam, is going to be. I would bow it in a little bit at the front, but this is where we get out the blue tape and start taping. Because what I will use is this half of the pattern to generate the paper pattern, and I will use the other sleeve, I think the other sleeve came off this one here, to use the sleeve. You only need half of this, obviously, because you're cutting it on the fold. So I will return with the blue tape, and we will talk about what I'm doing then. Now I'm going to try to stay out of the way of the camera as best I can. You can see here I adjusted this seam allowance a little bit. Armholes are a little deeper in the front, a little flatter in the back. And so this may not be scientific, but it works. So I'm going to use my painter's tape and just come in here and just smack that down. It may seem unscientific, it may seem a little bit ad hoc, but that's really what I want to do. I'm not going to tape that because that's split on the seam, so I'm just going to sever this right along the seam. But before I do that, what I plan on doing, I want to mark some matching notches because we want to know that these are going to match up. So it's just good to have matching notches as you go. So yeah, that is, may not be pretty, but it works. So my next step, which I will do off camera, is I'm going to come in here. Well, actually, I should just do it now, so you can see. I'm going to take the scissors and just cut right along this stitching line. Because again, you don't have to take the seams out because you're not going to be putting this back together. You just want to take this apart for a pattern. So you don't need to actually go through all that extra work. And so you can see here, I'm cutting it along here. And this little scoop in here, I think now I will just put a little bit of tape there just to solidify it. There we go. So from here, I'm going to just take this off and flip it over, and I will show you the result. So here you can see you have the outline of the armhole on both sides, and I have cut the seam all the way down. At this point you can get rid of any of these seam allowances if you need to, because this is pretty much ready to copy off onto fresh paper. That will be next. Now, one other consideration before I start copying this off. I wanted to determine the grain lines, and if you look at the coat, the grain lines are pretty much parallel to the center front, and so this edge here, which joins the front facing, I'm making parallel. So this is the lengthwise grain, and you just want to determine a crosswise grain, and you can just do that by pulling the fabric crosswise. You're estimating a little bit. Now here I was able to see a lengthwise grain, and there was a snag that created the crosswise grain here. So I think it's kind of interesting that they have put the seam here because the entire coat is cut as one, and I think their aim was that they want all of this to drape in a similar manner to the back of the coat. That's why this is not cut with the straight of grain on the center back, because that is the center back seam. So you can see here the hem the roll hem finishes here, then this is actually what sews to the hem allowance on the garment. This hangs free. So now we have some grain lines, and one thing I've done at the shoulder is I went ahead, you can see kind of up in here, I marked the pleat at the shoulder, and it's now 7 o'clock, just in case you're wondering. So I will take this over to the pressing table, press it out, roll out some paper, and meet you back here. So here I have the front spread out on a piece of paper. I'm going to try to stay out of the camera's way, but I may not be able to totally do that. So the first step really is to trace around and up along the stitching lines, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making a pattern with stitching lines. Now, eventually I will add the seam allowances that are indicated on the lining, so I can just sew this in by machine. But there are certain things, like for example, this little pleat up at the top. I'm going to mark that pleat and mark the shoulder. Also the lengthwise and crosswise grains. And if it shifts a little bit, don't sweat it. We can true all this up later. We just want to get the information onto the paper where it's a little more solid. Now, if this lining were in decent shape, I would have just used the lining itself to cut the pattern, or to cut the new lining. But like I said, this is kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're coming up here. And then this is where the armhole, the information that we have somewhat sort of patched together, is going to come in handy. So I'm going to follow this. We can true up the armhole later, and I'll show you how to do that. And I think, yes, I think we have everything. So now I will go off camera and trace off the back and bring you the results. So here we have the front and the back, as you can see. These are all the stitching lines. Now, mark your patterns like you're going to be stricken with amnesia at any moment, because if you don't, you will be. So next, I want to get the information from the sleeves. So here we have the sleeve that I chose that has more information. You can see here on the front, matching notches, double matching notches for the back of the sleeve, and there is the notch that I made when it was actually still attached to the body. Now this really, again, is a simple matter of coming in and just cutting right on the stitching line. Now what I will have to do after I have everything separated, so we have a little bit of fraying here, I'm going to have to come in here and do some bandaging with the painter's tape, which is no big deal. But like I said, I chose this one because it is in less sad shape than the other one. And so here, yes. So that's, yeah, there we are. So there we have the two pieces separated. So now let me just slip the upper sleeve out. Now you can see it's looking a little ragged, but that's okay because we're just going to pull that together a little bit and slap some tape on it. Now, one thing I did do before I brought this over here is I pressed it out a little bit. And so now that we have this, we can get rid of that. Now I can figure out what the grain lines are. And this is just, you know, you look at the back of the fabric, you can see the grain line on the back of the fabric a little more readily than you can on the front with the satin. So that is the grain line here. And there are times, like I said, you just have to guess. You know, I've done this enough so I can sort of figure it out. But a lot of times the fabric will give you a clue. So if you pull it this way and pull it this way, you can kind of see that, okay, there's a cross grain and, oh, there it is. There's the lengthwise grain. Now there are some general rules for certain kinds of things. On a garment, a lot of times the grain line will be perpendicular to the hem, and it looks pretty much like that's what's happening here. On some of these two-part sleeves, the grain line will be a little different. So now we have, get rid of that. So we have our upper sleeve, we have our undersleeve. So I will take these off camera and trace them also onto the paper with the matching notches and bring them back here to show you. So here we have the front pieces. And what you can see here, I like to measure the two side seams. That's this here is the side seam on the back lining. And side seam on the front. You want to make sure that they measure the same length because the two of them actually sew together. And so if I needed to adjust, I would adjust down here. Easiest way to go. So now I'm going to show you, it's called walking a seam. So this is the back shoulder. There is the notch where the little pleat is that's going to be joining to the front. So walking a seam, and you can see I've kind of done the work already, but I'm just going to take you through the process. Just turn this down. There we are. Okay. So I'm assuming this is the folded edge. This is where the lining will join to the facing of the body. So that's where I line it up. And so my pleat matches there. But then you want to jump across the pleat. You don't want to include that in because that's extra. And so then you can see here, I had to come down. There we are. I had to come down a little bit to make the two shoulder seams match. Now, pattern making wise, if you see little slashes, how I learned it was that line cancels, and circles are the lines you keep. So what I've done here is I really wanted to make sure that the body pieces walk well, because the next step is going to be measuring the armhole. So you can see here that I've pinned the shoulder seam together. Now you can measure this in 2 goes, but I think for what we're going to be doing here, it's a little easier to see just what we're doing. So you're going to take the tape. Now I'm going to talk about this for a moment. Don't stand the tape up on his edge. It marks you as someone who's not in the know. My teacher Simone smacked my hand when she saw me do that the first time. So what you're going to do is you're going to walk, and you can walk it. You can use a pencil point, you can use your thumbnail or a fingernail, but you're laying the edge of the tape and walking it. And some people will want to help you and hold that end. Tell them no, it needs to move freely. So what I'm doing is walking this. It gives you a better, more accurate measure. And so what we get here, the measurement we get, 25.5. All good. Our next step is measuring the armhole on the sleeve. So here we have the 2 sleeve pieces, the upper sleeve, the undersleeve. Now, what you can see here on the undersleeve, point this out, you can see that I have the matching notches and I have the finished seam lengths of the sleeve. So when I go to the upper sleeve, you notice it says 15.5 finished. We need to ease 1/4 inch. So that is on the sleeve front, and we're going to ease between the notches 3/4 inch at the back. So in actually justifying correcting the pattern, since I cut this apart, I could see that they're going to be easing a little bit here and easing a little bit here so that the sleeve actually fits the arm better. From here, this is where you join these together, or you can measure them separately, but really, again, it's just a little easier to see for what we're doing. So I'm going to join these together, make them match. And so I will, again, walk the tape, starting here. And when I walk it around, I've already measured this, so just so you're, in case you're wondering, it comes to 26.25. So now, 26.25, that is the armhole on the sleeve, and then minus 25.5, which is the bodice, leaves us 3/4 inch cap ease. Now, that is cap ease. That is what you want for a lining. You don't want to have too much extra because it's a lining, it's going to buckle otherwise. So, in this particular exercise, I'm going to pat myself on the back for a little bit. I was able to kind of figure out, just by what the shreds of the garment were giving me, what the shape of the armhole on the bodice was, what the shape of the armhole on the sleeve was. So what I will do before I actually cut is I will add the seam allowances. I'll refer back to the pieces of fabric to see what seam allowances we need, as it will tell us. And so most of them are going to be 1/2 inch. The hem allowance obviously is going to be 1.5 inches. The up in here, again, I'll have to refer to the other pieces, but this is where I will not use the dual tracing wheel and the carbon paper. I will construct this like it was constructed originally by adding the required seam allowances and just sewing it to the garment. So we have our patterns, we have the sleeves, of course, we have the bodice pieces that we'll bring in because there they are. So the next step really is to figure yardage, go by the fabric, and cut it out. And so I will meet you back after it's cut out. Now it occurred to me, as you can see here, I have all of my cutting lines marked. It occurred to me that I didn't mark matching notches. You can see this here and this here, because I want to know how the sleeve matches up to the body. Now normally I match at the underarm when I'm drafting, but I didn't really have any kind of indications on the fabric itself because all of this area in here was pretty much gone. So this is my reasoning. This is how I came to figure out where these spots are. So assuming we have the 3/4 inch cap ease, what I did was I know that this matches the shoulder seam. So I measured 3/8 one way, 3/8 the other way, a total of 3/4 of an inch. So I matched this onto here, and I was able to see through the paper and walk it down along the seam, matching the stitching lines, and that is what got me this here. So this distance from here to here equals this distance from here to here. And similarly, on the other side, again, since we're working with the back of the sleeve, I matched that notch to here and walked everything down to where I got that one there. So this distance here equals this distance here. And it's 8 o'clock with a brilliant idea. So what you can do if you want to worry about your easing, I actually start the ease about halfway up. I like the ease down a little further. Some people want it high up here. I like it down a little further. A longer stretch of the seam to ease makes it ease much more readily. So now we have everything marked and we are ready for cutting. As you can see, I have everything cut out. I will sew this all together and bring you back the lining before I install it. So I'm back with the lining. And aside from sewing the sleeves in, what I have done is pressed up the cuffs about 3/8 of an inch. This makes it easier for hand finishing. And on the hem, here is the center back, and the hem hems to the side seam because this part, as you can see, I've hemmed it with a blind hem, and then this will sew to the hem of the garment. So this part is loose. So that is really what you need to know. So what I will do next is install this into the code. I'm not going to really do any video on that because it's pretty straightforward. And here we are. Our lady has her lining in. You can see here. I will give you a little more detail in a moment, but you can see it's all sewn in. And where she's headed now is going to be the dry cleaner. She needs to get a dry cleaning and a steaming to be absolutely perfect. So let me show you some details. So here we have the inside. All of this area here was what was shattered in the original lining. So I was able to figure out what I needed to do to replace that. Now, also, I just like showing this little corner detail. Turned out rather nicely, if I say so myself. So when you're lining, what I did is from the inside, I sewed the seam allowances of the armhole on the lining to the coat, and I did a little tack. You can kind of see it right, well, it pulls a little bit. You want to tack the underarm so that everything stays put. Other than that, it's primarily a machine installation down to the hem. And so from here, this is hand closed, and then this is put up by hand. Kind of see. Until roughly the side seam. And as you saw earlier, it's hemmed separately. And this really partly is because the sweep of the coat is a little longer than the sweep of the lining, and partly because two separate layers move a little more independently than the two layers sewn together. So yeah, here we are. It's all in pretty good shape. Other than that, I may go in there and just check and make sure that the hemming is solid before I send it to the cleaners. But here we have it. So our lady has her lining, and I will take it to the cleaners and bring it back when she's done and in her perfection. And that is the story of how Adele got her lining back. I hope you've enjoyed it.